The winter of 1886 brought heavy snow to the mountains of Arizona Territory. Chief Nietzsche, grandson of the legendary Cochise, watched from a high ridge as blue-uniformed soldiers made camp in the valley below. 200 men had been sent to capture him and his small band of Apache warriors. The soldiers believed they had the upper hand with their numbers, modern rifles, and military training. Nietzsche counted only 37 warriors with him, including his trusted friend Geronimo's nephew Perico. The odds seemed impossible. Most chiefs would have retreated deeper into the mountains or surrendered to avoid bloodshed. But Nietzsche had something the white soldiers did not understand, a deep knowledge of the land and weather that his people had gathered over countless generations. The Apache chief studied the thick clouds gathering above the peaks. His grandfather had taught him to read the sky like a book. The wind carried a bitter cold that spoke of a coming blizzard. Snow would fall heavy and fast before morning. While the soldiers huddled around their fires, confident in their superior numbers, Nietzsche began forming a plan that would use the white man's ignorance of the desert winter against them. He called his warriors together in the shelter of tall pine trees. Their breath formed white clouds in the freezing air as he spoke in hushed tones. "The bluecoats think they know this land because they have maps and compasses," Nietzsche said. "But they cannot read what the wind tells us. They cannot see what the clouds promise. Tomorrow the mountain spirits will give us the weapon we need to defeat them." The soldiers below had made a fatal mistake. They chose to camp in a wide valley, thinking the open space would prevent surprise attacks. Their commander, Captain Morrison, had positioned sentries on the surrounding hills. He felt secure with his overwhelming advantage in firepower and numbers. The Apache were trapped, he believed, with nowhere to run. But Morrison did not understand that the Apache had never planned to run. As the first snowflakes began to fall in the darkness, Nietzsche and his warriors prepared for a battle unlike any the U.S. Army had ever faced. The chief knew that by sunrise the storm would transform the battlefield completely. The white men's advantages would become weaknesses, and the Apache knowledge of survival would become their greatest weapon. The snow fell harder as the night deepened. While the soldiers slept in their tents, confident that the weather worked in their favor by making escape impossible, the Apache warriors silently prepared. They gathered special materials from the forest: pine boughs, animal hides, and long strips of bark. Each item would play a crucial role in the coming battle. Nietzsche moved among his men like a ghost, giving quiet instructions. Some warriors began crafting unusual snowshoes from bent branches and leather strips. Others prepared fire-hardened spears with specially carved points. The chief himself worked on creating what looked like large woven baskets, but these containers would serve a purpose no white soldier could imagine. As dawn approached, the storm reached its full fury. Snow fell so thick that a man could barely see 20 feet in any direction. The temperature dropped far below freezing. In their warm tents, the soldiers cursed the weather that had made their mission more difficult. They had no idea that this same storm was about to become the instrument of their defeat at the hands of one clever Apache chief who understood the true power of winter in the high desert. Morning came with a world transformed into white silence. The blizzard had dumped 4 feet of fresh snow across the valley floor. Captain Morrison emerged from his tent to find his carefully planned military camp buried under drifts that reached his waist. His soldiers struggled to dig out their equipment and horses. The cold was so intense that rifle mechanisms froze solid within minutes of exposure. Morrison tried to maintain order as his men fumbled with numb fingers to start cooking fires. The green wood they found burned poorly in the thin mountain air, producing more smoke than heat. Several soldiers already showed signs of frostbite on their exposed faces. The captain realized that his army, designed for conventional warfare, was unprepared for winter combat in Apache territory. Meanwhile, high above on the ridge, Chief Nietzsche watched the confusion below with satisfaction. His warriors had spent the pre-dawn hours implementing the first phase of his ingenious plan. They had used their specially crafted snowshoes to move silently through the deep snow, positioning themselves at strategic points around the valley. The storm provided perfect cover for their movements. Each Apache warrior carried one of the woven baskets that Nietzsche had helped create during the night. These containers now held tightly packed snowballs, but not ordinary ones. The chief had ordered his men to pack the snow around small stones, creating ice projectiles that would hit with devastating force. More importantly, each snowball contained a hollow, center filled with pine pitch and charcoal, materials that would serve a special purpose when the battle began. The Apache had also prepared another surprise for the trapped soldiers. During their nighttime movements, the warriors had used their knowledge of mountain wildlife to gather a secret weapon. They had located several beaver dams upstream from the soldiers' camp. Working quietly in the darkness, they had carefully broken through the ice and removed key support logs from the dams. Nietzsche knew that when the sun climbed higher and began melting the fresh snow, the damaged dams would release torrents of icy water down the mountainside. The flooding would not reach the soldiers immediately, but it would create chaos and further weaken their position. The chief had timed everything perfectly, understanding how quickly conditions could change in the high desert winter. As the morning progressed, Captain Morrison tried to organize his men for a march up the mountainside to attack the Apache position. But the deep snow made movement almost impossible for soldiers wearing heavy boots and carrying military equipment. Their horses foundered helplessly in the drifts. What should have been a simple climb became an exhausting ordeal that left the men gasping in the thin air. The Apache warriors watched from concealment as the soldiers struggled upward. Nietzsche had positioned his men in 3 groups along the slope, each hidden behind natural rock formations and snow-covered pine trees. The white men advanced in a straight line, following military tactics that worked well on open battlefields, but proved disastrous in mountain warfare. When the soldiers reached the halfway point up the slope, Chief Nietzsche gave the signal for the second phase of his plan. The warriors began hurling their specially prepared snowballs down the mountainside. To the confused soldiers below, it seemed like a harmless, almost childish attack. They laughed and continued climbing, brushing off the snow that struck their uniforms. But Nietzsche's snowballs were far from harmless. When they struck, the hidden stones created painful impacts that stunned and bruised the soldiers. More importantly, the pine pitch and charcoal left dark stains on the white snow around each impact point. Within minutes, the entire slope was marked with a pattern of dark spots that would serve a crucial purpose in the next phase of the Apache chief's brilliant strategy. The soldiers pressed onward, unaware that they were walking into a trap more sophisticated than any they had encountered in their military careers. The sun climbed higher and its rays began to work on Chief Nietzsche's carefully laid trap. The dark stains from the pine pitch and charcoal in the snowballs started absorbing heat from the sunlight. While the surrounding white snow remained frozen solid, these dark patches began to melt rapidly. Within an hour, the marked areas had become soft, treacherous spots that would give way under a man's weight. Captain Morrison noticed his men beginning to stumble and sink unexpectedly as they climbed. Soldiers who had been making steady progress suddenly found themselves waist-deep in hidden snow pits. The dark patches had created weak points in what appeared to be solid ground. Men carrying heavy equipment fell through the surface and became trapped in the deep snow below. The Apache warriors remained perfectly still in their concealed positions, allowing the sun to do much of their work for them. Nietzsche had studied this mountain for years and knew exactly how the morning light would strike the slope. His grandfather had taught him that nature could be the most powerful weapon if a warrior understood how to use it properly. As more soldiers became trapped in the unstable snow, their formation began to break apart. Men struggled to help their fallen comrades, dropping their rifles to dig with their hands. The bitter cold made their movements clumsy and desperate. What had started as an organized military advance turned into chaos as soldiers scattered across the mountainside, each man fighting his own battle against the treacherous terrain. This was exactly what Chief Nietzsche had planned. He raised his hand, and his warriors began the third phase of their attack. From their hidden positions among the rocks and trees, the Apache fighters started a carefully coordinated assault. They did not charge down the slope like conventional warriors. Instead, they used their superior knowledge of the terrain to strike and vanish like mountain spirits. The Apache moved on their specially crafted snowshoes, gliding silently across the surface while the soldiers floundered below. They appeared from behind snow-covered boulders, released arrows or threw spears, then disappeared again before the confused soldiers could return fire. The white men found themselves fighting an enemy they could barely see. While struggling against a landscape that seemed to fight alongside their opponents, Captain Morrison tried desperately to regain control of his scattered forces. He shouted orders through the thin mountain air, but his voice was muffled by the snow and lost in the wind. Many of his men could not hear him over their own labored breathing and the sounds of their struggles in the deep drifts. The military discipline that had served them well on level ground crumbled in the face of this unconventional warfare. The Apache attacks came in waves, each strike perfectly timed. When soldiers gathered together to form defensive positions, warriors would emerge from unexpected directions to break up their formations. When the men spread out to avoid clustered targets, individual fighters found themselves isolated and vulnerable to surprise attacks from the mobile Apache forces. Naiche himself moved like a ghost across the battlefield, appearing wherever his leadership was needed most. He carried a war lance decorated with eagle feathers and bear claws, symbols of his spiritual connection to the mountain spirits. To his warriors, he seemed to possess supernatural powers as he guided their movements with perfect timing and precision. The soldiers began to realize they were not just fighting men, but battling an enemy who had turned the entire mountain into a weapon. The snow, the rocks, the trees, and even the sunlight worked against them. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they could not move effectively or coordinate their attacks. Their modern rifles were useless when they could not see their targets clearly or maintain stable firing positions. As the morning wore on, the psychological impact of the Apache strategy began to take its toll. The soldiers had expected a conventional battle where their training and equipment would give them clear advantages. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare scenario where every step could be a trap and every shadow might hide an enemy. Fear began to replace confidence as they realized they were fighting a kind of warfare for which their military education had never prepared them. The sound of rushing water echoed through the valley as Chief Naiche's timing proved perfect once again. The damaged beaver dams upstream had finally given way under the pressure of melting snow and ice. Torrents of freezing water cascaded down the mountainside, following natural channels that the Apache chief knew by heart from years of hunting and traveling in this territory. Captain Morrison heard the roar and turned to see walls of icy water flooding into his abandoned base camp below. Tents, supplies, and equipment disappeared under the churning rapids. The soldiers' horses, already weakened by the cold, panicked and broke free from their picket lines. Some animals were swept away by the flood, while others scattered into the forest where they would likely freeze or starve. The flooding served multiple purposes in Naiche's grand strategy. It eliminated the soldiers' supply base and escape route, but more importantly, it created a psychological impact that shattered whatever remained of military morale. The men on the mountainside watched helplessly as their lifeline to civilization vanished beneath the raging waters. They were now truly trapped in hostile territory, with no way to call for reinforcements or retreat to safety. The Apache warriors pressed their advantage as the soldiers' situation became increasingly desperate. They had prepared special arrows with points designed to punch through the soldiers' heavy winter clothing. Unlike conventional battle tactics that relied on overwhelming force, the Apache strategy focused on wearing down their enemies through constant harassment and the relentless pressure of the harsh environment. Naiche divided his forces into smaller groups that could move independently across the mountainside. Each group knew exactly when and where to strike for maximum effect. They would emerge from concealment, attack swiftly, then vanish again before the soldiers could organize an effective response. This hit-and-run approach prevented the white men from using their superior firepower effectively. The warriors also employed psychological warfare techniques passed down through generations of Apache fighters. They made eerie calls that echoed off the canyon walls, sounds that resembled mountain cats or hunting wolves. To the exhausted and frightened soldiers, these noises suggested that they faced not just human enemies but supernatural forces that controlled the very spirits of the wilderness. As afternoon approached, the temperature began to drop again despite the bright sunshine. The melted snow from the morning started to refreeze, creating a treacherous layer of ice over the remaining drifts. Soldiers who had struggled with deep snow now faced an even more dangerous surface that could not support their weight, but was too slippery to provide secure footing. Captain Morrison attempted one final push to reach the Apache positions before darkness fell. He gathered his remaining effective fighters, perhaps 60 men who were still capable of combat. The others were scattered across the mountainside, trapped in snow pits, wounded by Apache attacks, or too exhausted and demoralized to continue fighting. The captain led his reduced force up a narrow ridge that seemed to offer the best approach to the enemy positions. But Naiche had anticipated this move. The Apache chief had spent the early afternoon preparing his most devastating surprise yet. His warriors had used their intimate knowledge of the mountain's hidden features to set up an ambush that would demonstrate the full extent of their tactical superiority. The Kaw ridge that Morrison chose for his attack was actually a natural trap. It narrowed to a point where only a few men could advance side by side, and it was flanked by steep drops on both sides. Worse yet, the Apache had spent hours preparing a surprise that would use the mountain's own geography as a weapon against the advancing soldiers. Hidden above the ridge, Nietzsche's warriors had constructed a series of snow slides using techniques their ancestors had developed for winter hunting. They had carefully loosened huge accumulations of snow and ice, holding them in place with strategically placed logs and rocks. When the soldiers reached the narrowest point of the ridge, a simple signal from the chief would trigger an avalanche that would sweep the entire military force off the mountainside. As Morrison's men struggled up the treacherous slope in their heavy boots, slipping on the icy surface and gasping in the thin air, they had no idea they were walking into the most ingenious trap any Apache warrior had ever devised. Chief Nietzsche watched from above, his hand raised to give the final signal that would end the battle in a way that would be remembered and retold among his people for generations to come. Chief Nietzsche watched the soldiers struggle up the ridge below him, their blue uniforms stark against the white snow. Captain Morrison led from the front, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he urged his exhausted men forward. The Apache chief felt no hatred for these white soldiers, only sadness that they had come to his ancestral lands with violence in their hearts, but he would defend his people with every ounce of cunning and courage he possessed. The moment arrived when the soldiers reached the precise point where the ridge narrowed most dramatically. Nietzsche could see the desperation in their movements, the way they stumbled and supported each other as they climbed. These men were far from their homes, following orders that had brought them into a world they did not understand. But understanding would not save them from the consequences of their invasion. The Apache chief lowered his raised hand, and his warriors began the careful process of triggering their snow trap. They used long poles to knock away the supporting logs they had placed during their preparation. The accumulated snow and ice above the ridge began to shift and rumble ominously. What had taken hours to prepare would be unleashed in mere seconds. The first soldiers heard the deep groaning sound from above and looked up to see a wall of white death descending toward them. Captain Morrison shouted warnings, but there was nowhere for his men to run. The narrow ridge offered no escape routes, and the steep sides meant that any attempt to flee would result in a fatal fall down the mountainside. The avalanche struck with the force of a freight train. Tons of snow, ice, and loose rocks swept down the slope, carrying away everything in its path. The soldiers disappeared beneath the churning white mass, their cries lost in the thunderous roar of the slide. In less than 30 seconds, the ridge was swept clean, and an eerie silence settled over the mountain. Nietzsche and his warriors watched solemnly as the avalanche continued down the mountainside, finally coming to rest in the valley far below. The Apache chief felt no joy in this victory, knowing that many brave men lay buried beneath the snow, but he had protected his people and his homeland using wisdom passed down through countless generations of desert fighters. The remaining soldiers scattered across the mountainside were now completely demoralized. They had witnessed the destruction of their commanding officer, and most of their comrades in a disaster that seemed to defy explanation. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Others simply sat in the snow, too stunned and exhausted to continue fighting. But Chief Nietzsche was not finished with his demonstration of Apache superiority. He wanted to ensure that any survivors would carry back a message that would prevent future military expeditions into his territory. The final phase of his plan would show mercy while making it clear that the Apache could destroy any army that dared to challenge them in their own domain. The Apache warriors emerged from their hiding places and began moving among the scattered soldiers. Instead of killing the defenseless men, they began offering them food and warm blankets. This unexpected kindness confused the soldiers even more than the devastating attack had. They had expected torture or execution, not compassionate treatment from an enemy they had come to destroy. Nietzsche approached a group of surviving soldiers who huddled together near a cluster of pine trees. They looked up at him with a mixture of fear and amazement. The Apache chief was not a large man, but he carried himself with a dignity that commanded respect. His weather-beaten face showed the wisdom of someone who had spent his entire life learning the secrets of the high desert. Through sign language and the few English words he knew, Naiche communicated a simple message to the survivors. They would be allowed to live and return to their people, but they must carry back the truth of what had happened on this mountain. The Apache had not won through luck or supernatural powers, but through superior knowledge of their homeland and careful planning that used every advantage the environment could provide. The chief made it clear that this victory was not the result of savage violence, but of intelligent warfare conducted by people who understood their land better than any outsider ever could. He wanted the white soldiers' leaders to know that future military expeditions would face the same fate, unless they learned to respect Apache sovereignty and wisdom. 3 days later, a bedraggled group of 23 soldiers stumbled into Fort Bowie, their faces bearing the haunted expressions of men who had witnessed something beyond their understanding. They brought with them a story that would be whispered around military campfires for years to come, though few would believe the full extent of what had actually happened on that snow-covered mountain. The surviving soldiers described how Chief Naiche had provided them with food, basic shelter, and guidance on the safest route back to civilization. The Apache warriors had even helped dig some of their wounded comrades out of snowdrifts and provided crude medical treatment for frostbite and injuries. This unexpected mercy had shaken the soldiers' assumptions about their enemies more than any torture could have accomplished. Captain Morrison's body was never recovered. The avalanche had buried him and more than half his command so deeply that not even the Apache, with all their knowledge of the mountains, could locate the remains. The official military report would list the expedition as a disaster caused by severe weather conditions, but the surviving soldiers carried back the truth of a battle won through intelligence, preparation, and intimate knowledge of the natural world. News of the defeat spread quickly through military circles in the Arizona Territory. Other planned expeditions against Apache bands were quietly canceled, as commanders realized they faced an enemy far more sophisticated than they had imagined. The story of the snow trick became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating indigenous warfare tactics and the importance of understanding local terrain and weather patterns. Chief Naiche returned to his people with a victory that had cost no Apache lives and had demonstrated the power of traditional wisdom in the face of modern military technology. His warriors had learned valuable lessons about using environmental conditions as weapons, knowledge that would serve them well in future conflicts. The chief had proved that a small force of fighters who truly understood their homeland could defeat any number of invaders who relied solely on superior equipment and numbers. The Apache leader spent the following months sharing the details of his strategy with other chiefs and war leaders throughout the region. His snow trick became part of Apache military tradition, studied and adapted for different terrain and seasonal conditions. The victory on the mountain had shown that indigenous peoples could successfully resist military conquest when they fought smart rather than simply fighting hard. Years later, when historians interviewed elderly Apache warriors about the great battles of their youth, they would always speak with particular pride about the winter when Chief Naiche turned snow into a weapon and defeated 200 soldiers without losing a single brave. The story became legend among the Apache people, a reminder that wisdom and careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The broader impact of the battle extended far beyond military considerations. It demonstrated to both Native American and white communities that indigenous knowledge systems contained sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that could be applied to practical problems in ways that formal education often missed. Chief Naiche had used meteorology, geography, hydrology, and engineering principles passed down through oral tradition to achieve a tactical victory that West Point Military Academy could never have taught. In the end, the snow trick represented more than just a clever battle strategy. It embodied the Apache philosophy that true strength came from understanding and working with natural forces, rather than trying to dominate them through brute force. Chief Naiche had not just defeated an army, he had demonstrated an entirely different way of thinking about conflict, survival, and the relationship between human intelligence and the natural world. The mountain where the battle took place remained sacred to the Apache people, not because of the violence that occurred there, but because it had been the scene of such a perfect example of traditional wisdom applied to modern challenges. Chief Naichi had shown that the old ways were not primitive or outdated, but contained profound insights that could overcome any challenge when applied with skill, courage, and deep understanding of the world around them.